In 1943, there was this thing called the Moscow Declaration that announced that all these criminals would be chased, quote, to the utmost ends of the earth and brought to justice.
They were the enforcers of Hitler's brutal regime, commanding armies, orchestrating atrocities, and holding the fate of millions in their hands. But when the war ended, everything changed. Did these men answer for their crimes, or did justice slip through their fingers? These are the German generals who were executed after World War II. Let's uncover their fates. When we think about justice after World War II, the Nuremberg Trials are one of the first things that come to mind. These trials weren't just about punishing the guilty. They set an important example for the world. For the first time, an international court came together to hold individuals responsible for terrible crimes against humanity. Wilhelm Keitel was one of the most senior Nazi officials to face trial. As the chief of the High Command of the German Armed Forces, Keitel was directly involved in many of Hitler's most brutal plans. He enforced the infamous Commissar Order, which demanded the execution of captured Soviet political officers. He also approved actions that led to the mass murder of civilians, the deportation of entire communities, and the suppression of resistance movements in occupied countries. At his trial, Keitel tried to defend himself by saying he was just following orders. But the court didn't accept this excuse. They made it clear that carrying out illegal commands didn't make him any less responsible. On October 16, 1946, Keitel was hanged. His last words were a plea for God's mercy on Germany. But for many, those words came too late. Keitel's actions had caused so much suffering, and his death marked the end of a man who had chosen obedience over morality. Alfred Jodl, Keitel's deputy and the chief of operations for the Wehrmacht, also faced justice. Jodl was a skilled strategist, but his involvement in war crimes overshadowed any of his accomplishments. He signed the Commando Order, which ordered the execution of captured Allied special forces, even if they were in uniform, a direct violation of the rules of war. Like Keitel, Jodl tried to argue that he was only following Hitler's commands, but the evidence against him was clear. The court found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Just minutes after Keitel's execution, Jodl was led to the gallows. His last words were a final farewell to Germany, showing a loyalty to a regime that had caused him unimaginable harm. In the end, his role in supporting the Nazi war machine defined his legacy. One of the most famous figures executed after the war was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to face trial. He was in charge of the Reich Main Security Office, which oversaw the Gestapo and the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads responsible for the mass killings of Jews, political prisoners, and others targeted by the Nazis. At this trial, Kaltenbrunner claimed he didn't know about the details of these crimes, but the evidence proved otherwise. Signed orders and reports linked him directly to the atrocities. His leadership embodied the cold and calculated nature of the Nazi regime. On October 16, 1946, the same day as Keitel and Jodl, Kaltenbrunner was hanged. He left no final words, remaining silent as he faced the consequences of his crimes. Another name tied to horrific war crimes was Friedrich Jeckeln, an SS officer responsible for leading mass executions in Eastern Europe. He commanded units in Ukraine and the Baltic states, where entire communities were slaughtered. Jeckeln even invented the sardine packing method, where victims were forced to lie in mass graves in layers before being executed. It was a chilling example of the Nazis' brutal efficiency. After his capture by Soviet forces, Jeckeln was tried in Riga in 1946. Witnesses and Nazi records revealed his role in atrocities like the massacres at Baby Yar and Rumbala. Found guilty, Jeckeln was publicly hanged in Riga, a moment of justice for the countless lives destroyed under his command. Hans Frank, known as the Butcher of Poland, was one of the most famous Nazis to face justice. As the Governor-General of occupied Poland, he oversaw the exploitation and brutal treatment of the Polish people. Frank helped create ghettos in cities like Warsaw and Krakow, forcing millions of Jews into horrible conditions before they were sent to death camps. His rule was marked by violence, and he played a key role in carrying out the Holocaust. At the Nuremberg Trials, Frank tried to show remorse, claiming he had rediscovered his faith, but the evidence showed he was deeply involved in the crimes. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On October 16, 1946, he was hanged alongside other top Nazis. His execution marked the end of his role in one of history's darkest chapters. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi leader in the Netherlands, also faced execution for his actions. During his rule, over 100,000 Dutch Jews were deported to concentration camps. He also forced thousands into labor and ordered harsh punishments for those who resisted. His leadership brought immense suffering to the Dutch people. At his trial, Seyss-Inquart claimed he wasn't as extreme as other Nazi leaders, but the evidence showed otherwise. He was heavily involved in the Nazi regime and its genocidal policies. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Before his execution, Seyss-Inquart made a final statement calling for peace, but it couldn't erase the suffering he had caused. On the same day as Hans Frank, he was hanged, bringing his dark legacy to an end. Justice after World War II wasn't limited to the Nuremberg Trials. Courts across Europe worked to hold Nazi generals accountable for their crimes. Johann Georg Reichert was one such general. He led the 286th Security Division on the Eastern Front, which committed terrible acts in Belarus. His unit burned villages, killed civilians, and deported thousands. These actions were part of the Nazis' efforts to control the region and crush resistance. After the war, Reichert was captured by the Soviets and put on trial in Minsk in 1946. The evidence against him was overwhelming, with survivors and records proving his role. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and hanged in front of 100,000 people. For those who had suffered under his command, it was a moment of long-awaited justice. Gottfried von Erzmannsdorf was another German general executed in Minsk for his crimes in Belarus. His troops were responsible for mass deportations and the destruction of entire villages. During his trial, evidence showed he had directly ordered these actions. Found guilty of crimes against humanity, Erzmannsdorf was hanged alongside Johann Georg Reichert in a public execution that served as a stark message. Even those in positions of great power would be held accountable for their actions. In Italy, Anton Dossler was one of the first German generals to face trial for violating the Geneva Conventions. He had ordered the execution of 15 captured American soldiers who were on a sabotage mission. These men, despite being in uniform and entitled to prisoner of war protections, were killed under Hitler's Commando Order. At his trial, Dossler claimed he was only following orders, but the court rejected this defense. He was found guilty of war crimes and executed by firing squad in December 1945. His case set an important precedent, showing that following orders was not an excuse for committing war crimes. Ludwig Kubler, a veteran of both World Wars, faced justice for his role in atrocities. He led the 1st Mountain Division in campaigns across Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union, where his forces burned villages, executed civilians, and deported thousands. After being captured in Yugoslavia, Kubler was tried by a Yugoslav court and sentenced to death. He was reportedly executed by firing squad, a fate shared by other senior officers tried in the region. Kubler's case highlighted the broad reach of post-war justice. Helmuth von Panwitz's story is particularly controversial. He commended Cossack forces that worked with the Nazis, carrying out brutal anti-partisan operations. After surrendering to the British, Panwitz likely believed he would be treated fairly. Instead, he was handed over to the Soviets under post-war agreements. The Soviets tried and executed him for the atrocities committed by his units. Some argue that Panwitz was directly responsible for the crimes, while others believe his execution was more about political expediency. Eberhard Herf, another key figure, was executed in Minsk for his role in the Holocaust. As a senior officer in the Ordnungspolizei, Herf oversaw police units that carried out mass shootings, deportations, and the destruction of Jewish communities in Belarus. His trial exposed the role of police in the Nazi genocide. Found guilty of crimes against humanity, Herf was executed publicly, alongside other high-ranking officers as a grim reminder of the widespread complicity in Nazi atrocities. The Nuremberg Trials and other post-war trials changed how the world understood justice after atrocities. They firmly rejected the excuse of just following orders and made it clear that individuals are responsible for their actions, even in rigid chains of command. This groundbreaking principle became a foundation for international law and set the stage for future tribunals, like those addressing the genocides in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The trials weren't just about punishment, they were about establishing a framework to prevent such horrors from happening again. The scattering of the executed generals' ashes into the Isar River was a clear statement from the Allies. By making sure there were no graves or memorials, they sent a strong message. These men would not be honored or remembered as heroes. It was a practical and symbolic way to cut ties between their crimes and any future movements that might try to glorify them. The trials and executions were not without problems. The execution method at Nuremberg faced heavy criticism. The standard drop method often caused slow, painful deaths by strangulation, with some executions taking over 20 minutes. Witnesses described prisoners struggling on the gallows, which led many to question if this cruelty undermined the idea of justice. Even for men guilty of such terrible crimes, some believed the process should have been more humane. There were also challenges with the trials themselves. Terms like crimes against humanity were new and applied after the fact, which some felt was unfair. Sentencing was another issue. In some cases, lower-ranking officers were punished more harshly than their superiors, raising questions about how justice was decided. These challenges showed how difficult it was to handle crimes on such a massive scale while trying to create new legal standards. Despite these flaws, the Nuremberg trials were a turning point. They showed the world's determination to hold people accountable for their actions and set important principles for justice in the future. History is full of lessons, and the stories of these German generals remind us of the devastating consequences of unchecked power and the pursuit of justice in the aftermath of war. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on our next deep dive into history. What topic should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.